Marriage rarely receives the attention it deserves, especially given the frequency with which it occurs. There are roughly 250 million women alive today who were married before the age of 15. And the devastating impact it has on girls and sometimes boys is impossible to overstate. It perpetuates poverty. It has lasting maternal and infant health ramifications, and it often contributes to violence. It's not limited just to distant lands, and it happens even in our own hemisphere. Child marriage cuts across countries, regions, and cultures. In our own hemisphere, Brazil and Mexico are 4th and 9th, respectively, in the world in terms of absolute numbers for child brides. India ranks 1st in the world, followed by Bangladesh and Nigeria, according to data from the Council on Foreign Relations. In many countries, child marriage is a systematic problem inextricably linked to other developmental issues, which this committee has focused on. For example, girls' education, which I chaired a hearing on in June. Leaving school early makes girls more vulnerable to child marriage, and marrying young often prevents girls from furthering their education. I hope we can further explore the nexus between education and child marriage during the course of today's discussion. Cultural traditions, poverty, and gender inequality also play a role. Given the manifold contributing factors, there is no single solution. Legislative and legal fixes, while important, will not alone provide the solution. Consider, for example, that a Human Rights Watch report released this month found that 1 in 3 girls in Nepal are married before they reach the age of 18, despite the fact that the legal age for marriage is 20. But the absence of simple answers must not lull us into complacency. The stakes are too high. In addition to the factors I've just described, there are contexts where insecurity, instability, violence, and war have exacerbated this problem. This reality prompted us to invite Assistant Secretary Richard to contribute to today's hearing, and I'm particularly interested in better understanding how refugee and otherwise displaced communities impact child marriage. Early assessments are cause for alarm. The Syrian crisis has been described as the single biggest humanitarian and refugee crisis of our time. Approximately 7.6 million Syrians are forcibly displaced, including many within Syria. More than 4.8 million have fled to neighboring countries like Jordan, where civil society groups reported growing incidents of child marriage. A May 2013 piece in The Atlantic featured the story of a 14-year-old Syrian refugee, Maya, who had just recently been engaged to a wealthy Lebanese man, age 45. The piece quotes Maya's mother as saying, quote, "I am marrying my daughters so they can be safe and we can be secure." Maya herself, understandably inconsolable, laments, and this is her quote, "The man I am marrying tells me I am the one who protects you. I am the one who feeds you. You have to do what I say or I will throw you in the street." She says, "I'm disgusted by him, but I'm doing this for my family so we can live in security." And she continued by saying, "He's right. He is the man who feeds us and protects us. And I would rather be violated by one man than by every man in town." There are many reports of wealthy men from surrounding Gulf countries further exploiting vulnerable refugee populations and essentially out there shopping for child brides, enticing families like Maya's with promises of material security and physical protection. These sobering realities were reflected in the findings of a recent interfaith humanitarian assessment mission led by the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, which observed that more underage Syrian girls are being married and at younger ages. Some of these early marriages are entered into for economic reasons. It's one less mouth to feed for families living in dire poverty. However, the group issued a report which found that other child marriages are intended to protect the girl from sexual abuse directed towards unattached girls or to provide an alternative to idleness resulting from not being in school. In some cases, early marriage is also occurring to assist men in gaining access to countries whose borders are, for the most part, closed to single men. A September 2016 story in a prominent German newspaper found that government officials have reportedly encountered hundreds of married minors among the refugee population. This phenomenon is not limited to Germany. Similar reports have now emerged from Denmark and Norway. According to one news report, at least 61 minors were married when they sought asylum in Norway last year. The youngest was an 11-year-old girl. Child and forced marriage is also being employed as a weapon of war by groups like the Islamic State and Boko Haram. Yazidi girls have reported being captured, separated from their families, and sold into sexual slavery. One victim recounted being taken to a wedding hall with dozens of other girls and women and told by ISIS fighters, "Forget about your relatives. From now on, you will marry us. You will bear our children." In some contexts, girls who are also religious minorities are especially susceptible to this abuse. This is true in Pakistan, which is the country with the 6th largest number of child marriages in terms of absolute numbers. Civil society organizations, especially those working in the area of religious freedom, note that forced marriage and conversion are prevalent among Christian and Hindu girls, particularly in Punjab and Sindh districts. Similarly, in Egypt, there have been reports for many years of Coptic Christian women and girls being abducted and forced to marry and convert to Islam. While today's hearing will focus on global dimensions of this issue, a domestic component comes into play when a U.S. citizen who is a minor is taken to another country, typically their parents' country of origin, and compelled into a forced marriage. It is my understanding that civil society organizations have for several years now engaged the State Department, particularly the Office of Overseas Citizen Services, to propose ways to improve protections and to support U.S. victims. However, it is unclear to what extent the Department has taken action. I hope we can address that today. As a father of 4, with 2 school-age girls, these statistics are particularly sobering, as each number represents a girl denied the opportunity to live up to her God-given potential. It represents a bride whose wedding day is not a celebration, but rather a memorial, as she marks what could only be described as the death of her childhood. I look forward to hearing from our administration witnesses about the scope of the U.S. government's work in this arena, about trends, about areas where we're doing things right, and areas where there's room for improvement. I'm also keen to hear from our panel of private witnesses. You have experience in the field, and that will contribute greatly to what can too easily become an abstract policy discussion. I'd now like to recognize our ranking member and ask if she would like to recognize, or do you want to go first, or have Senator Durbin, who I know...
I'm happy to yield to my colleague because I know he's got things on his agenda.
Senator Durbin, I appreciate you taking the time to come here. You've taken a leadership role on this issue for many years now, and you're more than welcome, obviously, to stay for the duration of the hearing, but we understand that you may be leaving after your remarks, as I know you've got a full schedule ahead of you as well. But thank you so much for your work and for being here.
Senator Rubio.
Let me, Secretary Richard, begin by asking kind of a big picture question, because as you look at the list, right, the top 5, India, Bangladesh, Nigeria, Brazil, and Mexico. I know that in the top 10, 9 of the 10 are viewed as fragile states, but nonetheless, if you look at this list, let's say the top 5, they have state entities. When you interact with your counterparts in India or in Mexico or in Brazil or in some of these other countries at the government-to-government level, what is their view generally of this issue? Is it, we know we have a problem, but we have so many other problems we have to deal with, or is it more along the lines of, this is our culture and our society, this is how things work over here, and you guys, can't impose some of your views on us, this is the way we do it in this society? I mean, what is the government-to-government?
I think when we talk diplomat to diplomat, there's general agreement that this is not in the best interest of girls. The problem is that they are embarrassed that this is happening in their own countries. And also it's happening to people who are not in the elites of society. There are people who are poor people or displaced people, as we were focused on. So what helps is when we raise the issue, because that puts it on the agenda of national security, foreign policy concerns that the U.S. cares about.
But beyond being embarrassed, is your sense that it's a priority for these governments? Is this something that, all things being equal, is a priority for them?
I suspect that what you said is correct, that for some of these governments, they have such a long list of issues that while this is on the list, it's not at the top. And by our raising it, though, it does certainly push it up the priority list. It gets it much more attention than were we not to raise it. We also are making it a priority by raising it in these international conferences. I know mentioning international conferences probably sounds deadly dull, but what we do is at the World Humanitarian Summit, at a child protection conference I attended in the UAE, for example, at the UN General Assembly meetings next week, we show up at very senior levels and we bring attention to these issues, and we engage then with very senior levels of these other governments. And so it becomes part of the conversation, and we get across how much we care, and then we back it up by providing funds to make a difference. So I think the U.S. has a very smart approach on it.
Well, so give me, I don't want to pick on any one country in particular, but 2 of these 5 countries are in the Western Hemisphere, which is also the overview of this committee. in Mexico and in Brazil, is a marriage between a 14-year-old and a 30-year-old legal under their laws? And perhaps Ambassador Russell.
Yeah, I'm happy to respond to that. I think just in terms of the way we approach it, we try to put it in a broader conversation, which is to say that almost every country, and I've just found in the course of my work that the most successful approach for us is to talk about how it's in their interest to do things that we're encouraging countries to do. They're not really so excited when I come in and say, you know, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. Sometimes I have to do that. But what I talk about generally is that all countries will be stronger if women are able to participate. It's just a fundamental principle, and it's the driving force for our work. It's why it's a State Department issue, because we think these countries, we know they will be more economically secure. We believe that they will be more stable. And part of the trick about this is how do women participate when girls are falling off in really alarming numbers. And so what we talk about is, look, this is in your interest to figure out a way to try to address these issues more aggressively. And we also put it in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals, where if all of these countries are pushing to develop more fully, how do they do that? Early and forced marriage is a specific target under the goals, under Goal 5, which is the gender goal. And it's because there's a recognition that child marriage, FGM, that these are issues, that these are practices that hold girls back. And if we want them to participate, they need to be able to do that.
I guess just to get back to the point I'm making about the Western Hemisphere, if you have a 45-year-old man married to a 15-year-old in Brazil or in Mexico, I don't know whether that's even legal under their laws, but that person tries to travel to the United States with his 14 or 15-year-old wife. Do our laws allow them, do we recognize them when they come in on a visa as a married? That's why I'm trying to understand the legal status of it in those countries, because they stand out only because I get the places. I'm not minimizing the tragedy of displaced communities and some of the other countries that are mentioned in this list. And I'm not saying there aren't severe poverty issues in both Brazil and in Mexico, but I think it's startling that 2 of the 5 countries in the top list here are in our hemisphere, and they don't have massive they don't have the same issues we've seen in the Middle East. So either these marriages are being recognized by their laws, and ultimately when they come to us and say, you know, we want to come into your country as tourists on a visa, and I'm here with my 14-year-old or 15-year-old wife, what's our...
I don't, I mean, we can follow up, and I'm sorry I don't know the answer to that, with consular affairs, how they treat that issue in particular. I know that there is a lot of concern about American citizens going abroad and getting married, and our consular folks are being trained on that and have worked very closely with actually some of the witnesses that you have here today on civil society to think about how we can do a better job making sure that they're looking for that of Americans who are going back to their home countries typically and getting married and coming back. But as to how we would handle that coming in, I honestly don't know the answer to that, but we can get that and get back to you on it.
So one step removed from the border, I can talk about how we are engaging now very productively with Mexico and the UNHCR to make sure that any children coming up from Central America through Mexico are treated humanely, that their cases are quickly analyzed, that Mexico add asylum experts to determine what's going on with these children, that they're walking alone through Mexico. You know, are they safe? Are they being trafficked? Have they been abused? Are they in peril? You know, it's because children should not be. So I can't talk directly to the situation of child marriage among Mexicans, but our piece of this, which is to look at the migration flows through Mexico, we are doing a lot more than we have, and it shows the importance of having a good relationship with Mexico so that we can be encouraging, supporting, prompting through this dialogue that's partly bilateral and partly with UNHCR and other governments.
Yeah, my curiosity about Mexico and Brazil is basically whether, I don't know how much of that is due to people that actually are from Mexico and how much of it is due to transitory populations that are coming through and for multiple reasons. I mean, I'm really curious about that aspect of it because it's the part, again, I'm just envisioning a young girl who's now entered the U.S. with her husband and decides this is not a real marriage. I wish I could. I mean, I'm curious, do we help her get out of that situation? Is there an asylum status for someone like that, trapped in a marriage of that nature? We can go into depth. I know the ranking member is ready to. It's part. Look, the humanitarian moral aspect of this, I think, is clear for everyone to see. And I think what you're alluding to is the deeper argument that the fact that 9 out of these 10 states that are on this list are unstable is probably the cause of it, but it's also the result of it.
Yeah.
You're basically saying this is a country where over half your population, unless they come from a wealthy family that can position them for success, is never going to be a part of civil society, is never going to be part of government, is never going to be part of your economy. They're not going to be innovators. They're not going to be producers. And their only hope is to get married to somebody who will take care of them. And it goes deeper into this argument that they are a burden on the family's finances. So let's figure out a way to move our girls as young as possible into the care of someone else. I mean, it's interrelated to the fact that why these countries fail,
Exactly.
both economically and geopolitically. In fact, I don't know of any advanced economy in the world that is successful marginalizing over half of its population. It just doesn't. It doesn't work.
They're not.
And it's actually more than half, because even among men in those countries, if they don't come from the right families and with the right education, they too are marginalized. So you add that together, that could be 80% of your population or more, but certainly over 50%. And so these things are interrelated. I do want to get to Senator Gardner's questions.
No, it's true.
And my final question for the panel, we have a second panel waiting, and you've been generous with your time, both of you have, is, and I think you alluded to it a little bit in your answer to Senator Gardner's questions, what is the best thing we are doing right now? If we were to say this is the one place where we really need to be involved in terms of turning this around, and my sense is the programs that create an alternative to child marriage for girls growing up and young women growing up and economically challenged or displaced families. But where could we best get results that will help us towards this goal of wiping this out in a generation?
Sure.
You know, what we're doing that I think will get good results is that we're working with strong support at the community level in these countries to change the acceptance of child marriage. And we support programs where there's a lot of talking to young people and talking to men and talking to boys, backed up by education for girls. And so that's at very much at the grassroots level. And at this diplomatic level, we are very much, I don't know how to diplomatically say in your face, we are very much pushing and encouraging and making these issues around empowerment of women and prevention of gender-based violence, including early and forced marriage, part of our platform of discussions. And we keep coming, we're not doing it once, we keep coming back and doing it over and over and over again. I don't know what diplomats think when they see us coming and our boss, and he's going to talk about these issues. They probably want to run and hide, but yet we keep coming back and talking about them. And I just wanted to mention on Bangladesh specifically, we have a very close relationship, working relationship with the Foreign Secretary of Bangladesh on migration issues and on because of the Rohingya refugees coming across and because so many poor Bangladeshis leave. And so it's very easy. Next week, I promise, I will raise this issue with him. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank you both for did you have an answer?
I was just going to say one quick thing, which is I think when you look broadly at child marriage, what we see in these conflict settings is an exacerbated situation. And in a way, it has to be treated somewhat differently, right? It's such a crisis, and in any crisis, whatever's happening is going to get worse. We see increased rates of domestic violence. We see increased early and forced marriage for different reasons, as Ann said. And sometimes parents literally will say, look, I'm trying to protect my daughter. I don't want her out, wandering around. She's vulnerable to other men. So we want to get her married so that somebody's taking care of her and she's protected. So I think, in a way, these conflict settings bring up a discrete set of issues. From our perspective, just stepping back more broadly, I really think if you ask me one thing to do, I think it is to try to keep these girls in school. And if we can do that, which is very challenging, and the relationship of why they drop out of school and get married is complicated. Sometimes they drop out of school to get married. Sometimes they're out of school and they get married. But regardless, if we can keep them in a quality education where we can talk to them about your value and make sure their parents understand that they will contribute to their families and their communities if they have the opportunities, I think over time that's how we're going to address it. Having said that, these numbers are alarming, as you say. And even though we are declining, the numbers of child marriage are declining around the world, when you look at the population coming up, we're going to barely be treading water unless we get ahead of this. And I think we have got to work with other countries to encourage them to do more, and I think we have got to do this work that we're trying to do at the State Department, which I am grateful, again, for your support of really trying to address these issues that women and girls face in a more comprehensive way. I think at the end of the day, it's the only way we're really going to solve the problem. But thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for your work and for your time here today and for your testimony. We're now going to move to our second panel. Your testimony, It's why we're here today, to try to figure out the way forward, both in our existing programs. I mean, the purpose of these hearings are threefold. One, to call attention to the fact that this is happening. It gets lost in the broader stories about everything else that's going on in the world. The second is to look at what we're doing and make sure it's sufficient in terms of dollars. And the third is that there are actually programs that work. So let me start out with the first part. This question is for both of you. Part of the issue here in both your testimony and what I've heard here today as well is the decision makers in these cases are not the girls. The decision makers are often either their families and or community or religious leaders. Number one, I mean, how do you influence what programs, what is a realistic and positive way to influence better decision-making by families and religious leaders? And are there examples of programs that have been successful at doing that anywhere in the world? Anyone can go first.
Yeah, so as I said, based on the evidence that we've seen in many contexts, absolutely right. It's the parents, it's religious leaders and community leaders who are driving that decision in the context where girls are not valued. There are some excellent examples out there where educating and rallying and engaging these adults have been successful once they understand the harms that child marriage can pose to the girl herself as well as to their family and their community in terms of health outcomes, educational outcomes, economic outcomes. They can be very powerfully engaged in ending that practice. So there are very good examples from Senegal, from India, where adults are leading the charge, religious leaders are leading the charge, parents are leading the charge for girls' education against child marriage that we can certainly emulate and expand.
But are those programs that happen internally that they took upon themselves, or did someone help prod them, move them,
I think
resource them?
There's a combination of factors. I mean, there are some parents, fathers of daughters like yourself, who recognize that their daughters have value beyond just being a wife and a mother. Their daughters should be educated. Their daughters should be engaged in communities. Look at Malala as a terrific example. Her father was and still is a tremendous leader in ensuring that she was able to continue her education. At the same time, programs, including those supported by the U.S., have been very helpful in identifying for community leaders some of the challenges that can be faced if girls marry and helping parents to understand that there are alternatives. So I think we've seen a combination of efforts, and we certainly haven't seen enough at scale to make the type of change that we need to.
And if I could just add quickly to that, when we look at the membership of Girls Not Brides, a number of the organizations who we work with were set up either by former child brides, or people who saw maybe their sister get married, who are from the communities and who work directly with some of the decision makers to help create that understanding of the negative impact. One of the things that actually led to the creation of Girls Not Brides was that many of these efforts were taking place in isolation, and we've been trying through our work to create a platform where people can learn from one another, because the types of discussions that you need to foster are the same, whether it's in rural Pakistan or rural Cameroon or in Brazil, and actually finding a way to share what works, how it needs to be done, how it can be scaled up is incredibly important.
Can I just ask, is this largely a rural phenomenon, or do you find it even in large urban areas? In terms of around the world, you see it everywhere where there's these characteristics?
It really depends on the country. It definitely happens a lot in the rural areas, but it can also be seen very much as a coping mechanism in urban settings, particularly in areas where there's a high risk of violence to girls.
The second question I have for both of you is along the lines of what I asked earlier, and that is at the government end. We interact with a lot of these governments, and in many cases, not just governments, it's regional or local governments who have even more influence than some of the national governments might have on an issue like this. I imagine, in my view, or from what I've read, they come in three strains, and there are governments that actually think this is a priority and want to do something about it. There are governments who say this is a priority, but either it's not a priority for them in terms of action, and then there are those governments who, quite frankly, have accepted this as part of who they are, and even if some of them might be embarrassed by it, it's just not something they have time or interest in, and maybe even are culturally think this is fine. So is that an accurate characterization of the governments we're interacting with, to the extent we're talking about places that have governments? In some cases, there might be some ungoverned spaces. But is this the experience we've had with, depending on the country, a lot of it, you get varying degrees of cooperation and or hostility from governments?
Sure. Yes, and actually our members in a number of countries have come together to form national partnerships, just like there's Girls Not Brides USA, there's Girls Not Brides Nepal, or Girls Not Brides Zambia, and in other countries. But one thing that our members find a lot is that when they work with government and when they have a progressive government that's actually interested in addressing this issue, there's a lot of openness to creating a national strategy, a national action plan. But often these governments, take the case of Nepal, that's developed a national action plan on child marriage. They don't have the resources to actually really implement that plan in any deep way because they've been facing so many other problems as well. So even in governments where there's a huge will, they need increased support from foreign friends, and this is where I think the United States could really play an incredibly important role. In some other countries, I think having the United States ask about what is going on within their country and how they are addressing child marriage is something that could also be incredibly helpful, because it highlights that talking about child marriage, talking about issues affecting girls, is not just some nice to have thing in the ghetto of the women's ministry, but is actually an issue that is of great interest to a foreign policy behemoth like the United States.
And I can add, you heard from Ambassador Russell and Assistant Secretary Richard about the same point, that when they do raise in diplomatic discussions this issue with governments, it helps to draw their attention to it. We also have the State Department Human Rights reports, which now report on child marriage in each country, and that raises the level of diplomatic engagement and attention by governments to this issue. One of the things that we're trying to do to get some of those governments that aren't yet on board with this is to help them understand the economic impacts of child marriage. So ICRW is working in collaboration with the World Bank to do a rigorous assessment of the economic costs of the practice, with the idea that we know the health-related costs, we know the human rights challenges, we know the education outcomes for child brides. That gets us only so far, unfortunately, with some of those governments that aren't as attuned to the issue. If we can share with them the economic impacts that the high prevalence of child marriage has, not only at the level of the girl and the household, but on up to the national level. And if we can help them understand that ending child marriage will save them literally billions and billions of dollars, that may help increase some of those finances that are needed to implement programs to end the practice.
Well, when I heard that and I didn't have a chance to follow up, I understand how interacting with a diplomat from one of these countries, the diplomat might be embarrassed and say, yeah, this is bad, because these diplomats travel the world, they're worldly and probably highly educated and exposed to the West and beyond the world. My concern is more those countries where at the regional or local level, there really just isn't a commitment, and in fact, quite frankly, an acceptance and or perhaps even participation in the case of some of these government officials in some of this. And that's the point I'm trying to drive. There are governments in the world who, at least at the place in which policy is truly driven and implemented, not discussed at an international forum, but actually driven on the ground by the local police department, the local municipal authority, and beyond, this is not only not an issue, but in fact, to them, this is none of our business, and this is the way things have been, and this is the way things are, and so forth. Is that a fact? There are places where at the regional, local, and perhaps even national level, the policymakers who are implementing these things don't view it, would look at this conversation here today and strongly disagree. Am I accurate in stating that? And if so, are you comfortable telling us who some of these places are?
But that's why just putting in place laws is not enough. It's not just a legislative fix. And in a number of places, there's been increasing amounts of work on working with a wide variety of actors. So parliamentarians, for instance, are getting together to really try and see what they can do to change the practice. But it's also like working on educating police departments and local and regional decision makers so that they also see their role within addressing the challenge. It cannot, as you say, just be at the national level. That interest in tackling the issue is something that has to come down. And that's where it's really important to have that combination of local and national civil society pushing the decision makers, because to really show that this is not a concern that's coming from the outside, that's coming from the West, but that is really coming from the people who are most affected by it, with the enabling environment and the support that's coming from external countries. And we are seeing change in a number of countries where 5 years ago, it was completely taboo to talk about child marriage in any sort of national, regional, international context. Last year, there was at the African Union a big summit of heads of state. Some of the countries have been vying with one another to see, it's almost like a little competition of who can actually put in place a national strategy, who's making commitments to address child marriage. And it's not enough. There's still a huge amount to be done. But even starting to get that change of mindset in the heads of government is something that is a really good step in the right direction.
Just my view, I know of and have seen cases of local governments and regional governments in part of the world that will not investigate rape charges. They just won't do it. They'll ignore it. They laugh about it. They sometimes insinuate that it's not a big deal, or perhaps it wasn't rape at all. If that's how they feel, can you imagine? I mean, if that's how they feel about that, getting them to prioritize and actually do something about child marriage at that level of government, I would imagine is a heavy lift. And I'm not arguing that we shouldn't try or do something about it, but ultimately it goes back to the argument you've made in that these programs are important. We want to make sure which are the ones that work, but there's got to be a change in government culture in these places and leadership culture to actually view this as something that's wrong, not just as the way things have been done for 1,000 years, and that's how we're going to keep doing it.
Yeah. You're absolutely right on that point. This is a challenge. I think Ambassador Russell said it. There is no one single solution to this challenge. We have to tackle it at different levels and in different ways. Certainly getting the engagement at the national level is critical, and we are doing that increasingly and seeing some amazing examples out there. I think you mentioned Nepal and Zambia. Those are two tremendous leaders at the national level, and they're using that leadership to then work down through the regional and community levels. But at the same time, that engagement from the community on up is critical. So this is where the diplomacy and development connection is really important. We need the State Department to continue engaging at that high level, and we need USAID and other programs, the Peace Corps, Millennium Challenge Corporation, to work at the community level and to support those local organizations and local leaders who are willing to make change in various ways.
Which brings me to my last point, and I hope that we can end on a high note here, and that is one of the best ways, I think, to achieve these goals, as you've argued, is to convince leaders that this is not just the right thing to do, it's actually good for your country. And so we would want to point to examples of places that have made these changes and as a result can point to economic progress, a more stable society, better governance, all the things that are good for everyone. And so I think you just mentioned one or two, but could you let's just reiterate for the record the one or two countries or more, hopefully, that are great examples in terms of the steps they've taken and the trajectory that they're on in terms of addressing this and perhaps even eliminating child marriage in the context they're facing. Where's the good news?
Yeah. There's good news in a number of places, but we are still very much at the early stage of this work. So So in countries like, as we said, Nepal and Zambia, there's been a huge amount of work that's already started. We're seeing change in the lives of individual girls, but we still need that great expansion of work to see a nationwide change. In places like Ethiopia, we've seen programs that have been taken from addressing the needs of a few hundred girls to now addressing the needs of a few thousand girls. That's incredibly important, and that's had a huge impact, but it's still not enough to meet the scale of the problem. So until we actually are able to massively scale up the work that's going on and that's showing promise, it's going to take a really long time to get to that answer of which country has been able to eliminate child marriage, because we know it can be done, and we've seen it happen in small pockets, but for it to happen at that nationwide scale, we really need that massive increase in investment, in political support, and in policies.
Completely agree with Lakshmi. I would just add this is a challenge that can be overcome, but it will take some time. We like to say in Girls Not Brides has this phrase that child marriage can be overcome within a generation. It will likely take that long. This is a practice that is deeply entrenched. It has existed for centuries, for millennia, and we have seen some tremendous examples of positive change. Nepal, Zambia, Ethiopia, Malawi, the latest figures are looking very promising. The more investment, the more attention, the more focused attention on advancing the rights of girls that we have in these countries, the multi-layered approaches that we implement, and the diplomacy, the continued discussions can help us overcome this challenge.
Well, I want to thank both of you for being a part of that, for your testimony, both oral and in writing, for your time, and for your work and advocacy on this. So the record on this hearing is going to remain open for 48 hours. And by the way, without objection, I want to submit for the record testimony provided by several other non-governmental organizations who are working on this issue. And again, I want to thank both of you for being involved. There might be some questions from members, even those who didn't attend. To the extent possible, I ask that you get those, because these all become part of the record that could ultimately be in the future part of justifying or supporting legislation and or correspondence on behalf of the Senate on this issue. And I hope we'll be able to revisit this again in a few months as we get into the funding cycles once again, and really hope to incentivize resources towards not just spending, so we can say we spent money on a line item called preventing child marriage, but in fact on programs that are functioning and working, that we can prove results, because it allows us to replicate that in other places and, quite frankly, convince our colleagues to continue to prioritize it. So again, I thank you both for being a part of this, and with that, this hearing is adjourned.